This meeting is being recorded.
So it's being recorded. So Lillian, again, if you want it, you'll all you have to do is go to shemaim.org, which is the shul's website, and you'll be able to find the shul's YouTube channel.
Very good. If it's
Okay.
on YouTube, I can get it on TV too.
Yeah. Okay. That I don't know. I mean,
Smart
I'm
TV.
not sure how, but you can try.
I'll try.
I'm going to, with your permission, I'm going to mute everybody so there's no background noise, and we'll have a chance to schmooze afterwards. So welcome, everybody. I hope you had a good week. Our week has been wonderful. Since the last time we met on Tuesday. The bris of our grandson was Thursday, Moshe Diamond. So he should grow up to Torah l'chupol u'masim tovim. And all of us should have nachas from those who are close to us, and they should have nachas from us as well. And we shall all be blessed with long life and good health. So we're moving to Parshat Truma. So Parshat Truma, as we say every year, really marks a big shift from the sorts of parashot that have preceded it, all the way from Sefer Bereshit to last week's parsha, which is Parshat Mishpatim. Parshat Truma changes because beginning with Parshat Truma, then there's Tetzaveh, Kitisa, Vayakel, Pekude. So much of those parashot are taken up by elements that involve the contributions for, the materials for, and the construction of the Mishkan and all the vessels that go with it. The vessels, the Bigdei Kahuna, and a description of the Mishkan. And I think probably for many of us, you could say, well, this is not exactly a gripping storyline. You don't have characters, you don't have an protagonist, you don't have a villain, you don't have a story, you don't have a climax. And for some, you could say, well, this is boring. So I'm hoping that you're not going to find it boring. There's some amazing ideas here, but let me just preface a little bit about what's going to happen, not just tonight, but going forward. So the whole notion of the construction of a Mishkan in and of itself poses a certain, I guess, philosophic quandary, a challenge that our Chachamim understood and really tried to deal with in a variety of ways. Now, the essential quandary is this: how is it possible that a God, whom we conceive as being infinite in so many ways, certainly in the physical realm, there is no physicality to God. It's one of the 13 Yud Gimel Ikarim. The Rambam says it when every time we sing Yigdal, we talk of Ein Lo Guf, Ve'eno Guf. God has no physicality. So God has no physicality. He's never bound by what we consider to be the laws of nature and physical restrictions. What purpose does God have for the construction of a physical place? God is more than just a concept, but he certainly isn't a body. He certainly isn't concrete. So if we conceive of God as the Kabbalists say, this Ein Sof, this infinite sort of power, then why does God deliberately instruct Bnei Yisrael, beginning in this week's Parshat Truma, to engage in the construction of some sort of physical domain, which ultimately becomes associated with his, with a capital H, his place, his palace, his temple, his Beit HaMikdash, his Mishkan? There's a philosophic quandary here. God doesn't need it, so why do we construct it that way? And then beyond that question, which may or may not have an answer, about which there is a lot of debate amongst the Jewish commentators, when we take a look at this parsha, and we're not going to read all of it, as you know, there's so much. When you read all the details, you say, oh my gosh, it's detail after detail after detail, measurements, texture, all these rules. Like, what's the point of that? And wherein lies the meaningfulness? I mean, I think it's much easier for all of us who are reading all the sections of the Torah that preceded tonight, all the narratives, for us to sort of connect to and to understand the story and the upset and the feelings and the strength and the weakness and the challenge. And we can somehow find ourselves in some part of the narrative and walk away inspired or troubled or wondering. But when you read this week's Parsha, you're going to say, well, there's nothing here that sort of touches me or inspires me, because it's just a list of numbers, of measurements, of how to build. And you may not even have that sort of chush, that sense of building. You may not be a visual person. You may be seeing things differently. So whatever I just said to you now is not unique to me and not unique to us. So much of that, in fact, was the attitude that our Chachamim had so many years ago. What's the purpose? What's the eternal message? And I've said this on so many occasions. The purpose of the Torah is for us to find ourselves in it. So in the 21st century, when we're living in the diaspora in Toronto in 2023, what possible connection could there be for all of us on this Zoom Shiur or anywhere to connect to a building that's not even there? And the Mishkan, in its truest form, was only intended to be for a short period of time. Now, it did truthfully last for hundreds of years, but then we had the Beit HaMikdash, which we don't have anymore. So those are some of the questions that I think I'm going to try and answer. But one of the things that you're going to see is that the Chachamim understood that if you start learning Chumash from the assumption, from the axiom, that this is an eternal book with eternal messages, then the details listed in Parshat Truma are not historical. They're not about a building that doesn't exist anymore. There's much more to it than that. And that's why the Chachamim mine Parshat Truma for so much of the symbolism. It can't be, which was the starting point of our rabbis, it can't be that this is just a retrospective look at history without any contemporary messages. And so we're going to take a look at Parshat Truma, and we're going to try to find those contemporary messages. So let me start with a general observation offered by Isaac Abarbanel, Spanish, and we talked a little bit about him. Lived in Spain. He was a courtier. He was a advisor to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he, along with the other Jews of Spain, was expelled in the year 1492. And much of his writing, I think, in some ways is affected by his life experiences. And in certain parts of the Torah, you can hear how the experience that he had bubbles forth to help shape and form some of the way in which he thinks about certain things. But I want to share his words tonight with you about the Mishkan in general. And like all the other Chachamim, the purpose of the Mishkan and the Kelim, the vessels, which are described to some extent in Parshat Truma and later on in Tetzaveh and Vayakhel, Pekude, those vessels were a source of question. What's the point of it? And so it's no surprise that he has what to say along with so many other of the Meforshim. But right now, let's just take a look at him. So the Mishkan says about, and I'm going to just read a paraphrase. I'm not going to read from him. By the way, it's a very interesting commentary. It's very long, very, very long. And one of the things you notice when you read the Abarbanel is his way of thinking. He first writes a list of questions that he's going to try and answer in his commentary. And the questions could run into the 20s, into the 30s, 32nd question, the 33rd question, very specific. And then you have to read his commentary and find out, so where's the answer to question number 26, 27, 28? Fascinating stuff. Anyways, so the Mishkan and its Kelim were meant, according to the Abarbanel, to entrench in us, to implant in us, through their holiness, through the preparation necessary, the glory of the divine presence in the minds of Bnei Israel, so that whatever tendency they may have to be overcome by thoughts of helplessness and futility would be eradicated. Now, why would they have that? Why would they sort of feel helpless? And why would they feel futile? Well, remember, where are they? They're in a desert. And people in a desert who they're wandering and don't sort of come across civilization, because that's the way in which the path Hashem took them, they're wandering in a desert. And for those who live in a desert, for some, and they weren't used to that, they were living in the great country of Egypt. Yes, they were slaves, but remember their experiences, their social interactions were interactions in this great metropolis, this great country in which amazing things were being built. But now they're in a desert and they see none of it. And perhaps they feel futile, but perhaps they feel overwhelmed by the vastness of the desert. And according to the Abarbanel, Hashem specifically wanted to create this Mishkan as a spiritual sort of breakwater to make sure that the potential of depression and futility, which could overcome them, didn't do so. So according to the Abarbanel, they would constantly be aware of Hashem's presence and his protection. And since human beings, maintains the Abarbanel, are physical, and their needs, our needs, are material and physical, it's easy for the people to think that Hashem, who has no body, has no material form, can be aware of their needs. You know, God is so other than us, so other. We're finite, we're limited, we're human, and Hashem is like of a completely different realm in which our own conception may be limited and weak and feeble. So it was possible for people to think that we're not part of Hashem's even radar because we're so lowly. So maybe Hashem is not even watching. Maybe Hashem is not even caring. Maybe Hashem is just sort of letting us wander through a desert. Maybe he's checking in and checking out sometimes, but we're on our own for most of the time. So mankind looks at their pettiness and weaknesses and frailty, and we might think that God, because of his greatness, is just not connected to us. That could lead to despair. That could lead to a sense of futility. And by the way, what I'm describing to you, the words I'm using, though these are Abarbanel's observations, somewhere in the early 1500s, I don't think that this is ancient. I think if you were to take a look and read some of the meaningful things that are being written in the 21st century, I think so many people are dealing with this notion of alienation, of isolation, and they're trying to answer questions of meaningfulness. It's not new. And so when you think about what Abarbanel is saying about the human condition, and somehow think about it in the modern world in which we live, this is very contemporary. The Torah suggests that one of the ways in which Hashem wanted to respond to what can become this overwhelming sense of being adrift and not being rooted, not being grounded, not being connected, not knowing where your meaning is, that was the Mishkan, according to Abarbanel's conception of it. And so therefore, Hashem created this notion to indicate I'm close to you in a physical sense. And yes, according to what Abarbanel is implying, there is a conceptually, philosophically contradictory nature, that there is some sort of physical expression of the closeness of God. God has no physicality, but we who are limited in our ability to sort of live at that level on a regular basis, we need something to help ground us, not Hashem. And so the Mishkan was Hashem's response to those needs in a time where there was a great tendency, there could have been a potential for the people to feel that because of the experience, the prolonged experience of living in a desert. And I wonder, there's an image that we all have of a desert as being a place that is entirely lonely, but so many sociological studies that are coming out are indicating that some of those same feelings that may have been the potential feelings of the Jewish people in the area of the desert, which was abandoned, you can still feel in a highly populated area, because just because there's a lot of people doesn't mean connection is automatic. And there are a lot of people in all parts of the world who are struggling to find that even while they're living in a highly populated area. A lot of people does not automatically lead to deeper connection. So in his, and I'm not reading everything, but as he goes through this very, very long commentary on Parshat Truma, the Abarbanel tries to give and explain the symbolism of the various kingdoms that Hashem created. So for example, again, I'm using paraphrase in English, not reading in Hebrew. When talking about the shulchan, that's the table upon which the showbread, the lechem apanim was, and the menorah, which you know that. He says the Shulchan and the menorah are to teach that all the plenty and all the successes that we have in life, whether they be material, which is symbolized by the Shulchan, and the lechem apanim, showbread. Bread is actually, made out of wheat. It's lechem. It's a material thing that we eat. God doesn't, but it's a symbolic expression of that material part of our lives. Or whether you're taking a look at the menorah, light, which obviously is a symbol not of the physical, but more of the spiritual, they all have one source. The source is solely Torah. In other words, we're elevating the physical, that too comes from God. So all of the things that are in the Mishkan are there to teach us messages about the life that we lead. That was the life that the Jews led in the desert, but we lead this life here in the 21st century in 5783, 2023, but we're still struggling with that. We also want to know what our meaningfulness is. What is the relationship between the physical and spiritual? And I think it's pretty clear when you look at social media and so many of the popular cultural entertainment industries. That's a question that we as a society have not yet really figured out. That balance between physicality and spirituality. And there are times that it seems like the physicality part is so dominant. And when it becomes dominant, what usually happens is I think that there is a yearning for the other part, which we feel to be impoverished and is not being nourished. And then you have all sorts of, I think, disconnects and dissonances that need to be treated. And one last thing, or actually a couple of things before we move on beyond the Abarbanel that I want to share with you tonight. One of the other things that you're going to see so much of, we're not going to read all of it, but when you do read it, either in preparation of the Torah reading on Shabbos or when you're in Shiur following on Kriyat Torah, you'll notice that measurements play a really important part. That all of the vessels have measurements. Well, the Shulchan does, the Aron Heidut does, the Shulchan does, the Mizbeach does. All of these things have measurements. The only thing that really isn't measured is the menorah. We may want to talk about that a little later. So the measurements of the Mishkan also teach us things. So why? Why did the Torah care about the measurements? Why not say build a Mizbeach? But now it's measured. It's measured. And here, no, this is how tall it has to be. This is how wide it has to be. So we get a lot of detail. And that just creates a lot of questions. So what's the divine wisdom behind that? Why does Hashem insist on these measurements? So according to the Abarbanel, the measurements of the Mishkan teach us the various periods and stages of our lives. That's so, I found that fascinating. The 100 amot of the Chatzer's length, okay, so we're talking about the length of the entire Mishkan, the Chatzer. The 100 amot of the Chatzer's length are the maximum allotted years of adulthood, while the 20 of the Amudim are the years of our youth, maintains the Abarbanel, while the 50 amot width symbolizes the 50 first years of life that are the best years, since after them the person begins to age and deteriorate. However, the vavim, those are the hooks that are on the around on the krushim, on the beams around. These vavim, the hooks, represent the urging, the desires, and the chukah, the yearning, with which one should, both in youth and in old age, says the Abarbanel, seek to draw close and cleave to him. Hooks do what? They connect. That's what a hook is. It connects. That's what a vav is. The Hebrew letter vav, when you read it in Hebrew, what's the purpose of a vav? We talked about this vav chibur. It's the letter that connects things. It means and. So according to Abarbanel, there's so many symbolic meanings to every single detail. And I want to conclude with this paragraph, but include the part about the Abarbanel with this paragraph. We may think, says the Abarbanel, that all the laws concerning the making and the erection of the Mishkan and its vessels that our fathers had in those days, but in Galut, we no longer have them, and they're meaningless to us. They slayed out in a real way centuries ago, but they have no impact except just points of interest. That's what you might think. So we may also consider the mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, those mitzvot that were only possible to fulfill while a person lives in Israel, to be valueless to us. Why? Well, we're living in Canada, we're in Putzlaritz, or wherever we happen to be in Putzlaritz. So what's the point of studying mitzvot that you can never fulfill while you're living where we're living in Galut, in exile? But however, says the Abarbanel, all the writings, all the laws, all the mitzvot written in the Torah, regardless of their nature and regardless of their current applicability or viability, says the Abarbanel, have wisdom and they have knowledge that's important for everyone till they are able to perfect their souls through correct and true concepts and ideas. The striving for spiritual perfection is not dependent on a certain time, not dependent on a place, not dependent even on conditions, but is that which we are commanded to cleave and to pursue, so that we may be faithful to his covenant and to his way. That's what this is about. The Mishkan in its entirety and its in details was this huge message about striving for something. And in that way, I think there's something, for me at least, really enormously encouraging about the Mishkan. Because if the Mishkan is really a collection of symbolic teachings, then that means that Hashem believes that you and I are capable of that sort of deep thinking. Like, Hashem is not giving us like a graphic novel to read in animated form because that's as much as we can tolerate. He's not. He's writing things in symbolic language, and he's expecting us to be able to dig deeper from the surface and to find the meaning. That's an incredibly, I think, empowering notion that we're capable of that. We have the ability to do that. And so we just need the time to do that. We need to set it aside and to think and to listen and to wonder and to question. And to me, that means Hashem has a lot of confidence in me. I can do this. And that's why he gave it to us. This is not an elitist book. Well, you're just going to give it to the highest ranking scholars of the country, and they're the only ones who can be able to figure it out. They may help me figure it out. They may offer ideas, but we can handle it. And I find that to be really in some ways very encouraging. I love a good story, but you and I know that a story, because of its construct, sort of is obviously going to grip us. But reading Parshat Truma and being prepared to say, I wonder what the symbolic meaning is an act of a much, I think, a deeper sort of thinking. And God believes we are capable of that. I don't know whether we live in a time where people want to be deep thinkers. I think we live in a time, I'm sorry for maybe I'm being a little bit too soapboxy tonight, but I do teach, and I teach kids, as you know, and it's a concern of mine. It's a concern of mine because the kids I teach, rather not have to think deeply. I'm sorry to say that. And I don't even just think it's kids. I think most people would rather not think deeply. We're used to fast sound bites. We're used to things which are not subtle. Nuance doesn't play well. And when you don't have a lot of patience, you want to cut to the chase, as it were. But so much is lost when you cut to the chase. So much of the beauty of the language, the depth of thinking, is eliminated when you say, okay, just tell me what the main point is. I don't want to read the rest. Just tell me the main point. And that's a lot of what goes on, I think. So Parshat Truma is take a deep breath, sit down, take a tea, take a coffee, read, and think. Okay, I'm starting with that. Let's turn to now Parashat Vayakhel. I'm going to take a look inside, as we do, with a couple of ideas that are rooted in the Psukim. So I'm now looking in Sefer Shmot, Pasuk, Perek, 25, Kapeh, Pasuk Beit. Again, you don't have to follow with your Chumash if you don't want to, but if you do, you're certainly welcome to. So we're going to be starting right at the beginning of Parshat Terumah. First Pasuk, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael, v'ikhu li terumah me'it kol ish asher yidbenu libo, tikhu et trumati. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel and let them take for me a portion. Truma means a portion. From every man whose heart motivates him, you shall take my portion. The Be'er B'nai Israel, one more time, B'chuli Truma, it's a portion or a contribution portion. Me'it kol ish asher yidvenu libo, from every man whose heart motivates him, Tiku et Trumati, you shall take my portion. Okay. So, and this, of course, is the opening declaration as it applies to Hashem's interest in having the Jewish people build a Mishkan. Okay, so I want to share with you an idea from Rabbi Dov Weinberger in his collection of thoughts on Chumash called Shem and Tov. Rabbi Dov Weinberger was the rabbi. I've said I love his work, so I quote him, I think, fairly often. He was the rabbi of the Young Israel of Brooklyn in the Williamsburg area. He was the rabbi there for over 40 years. And he says, first of all, there's a very famous midrash which tries to explain in a parable in some ways what the purpose behind the construction of the Mishkan is. Now, again, we introduced it generally. I tried to give you a little bit of thinking with Barbanel, but it's a question that's on the minds of everybody, even the minds of our ancient Tanaim, the ones who formed for us so much of our Torah Sheba'al Peh. So there's a mashal, the Midrash says, a parable to a king who had a beautiful daughter. It was the only child, a beautiful daughter. And of course, one of the princes came and wanted her hand in marriage. So the king let her get married, but the prince who married this beautiful daughter wanted to take his wife, the king's daughter, back with him to where he came from. It's a faraway land. So the king turns to his son-in-law, the prince, with the following request. Biti shenatati lecha yichiditi. The daughter whom I have given you is my only child. She's my only daughter. The paresh mimena eineni yachol. It's so difficult for me to separate from her. She's my daughter. And I can't just let her go. Lomar lecha el titlena eini yachol. To tell you you can't take your wife back to your home, to your country, I can't say that to you. I know that. But the thought of my separating from my daughter is very difficult. Ela zotova aseli. So I'm asking you to do this for me. This is the midrash. Shekol makom shata holech kiton echad aseli shadur etzlecha. So wherever you go, I ask that you set one small space aside so I can come visit, and I'll always have a place there. That's the midrash. And that midrash is being offered as a comment to the Mishkan. So it's not entirely clear what the equivalency is, what the parallel is. The story, I think, is clear. We understand what it means, the longing to always be near somebody who's very beloved. But who plays what role? There's something called the mashal and the nimshal. There's the parable, and the parable presents to us symbolic characters. So who is being represented in this parable? So Rabbi Dov Weinberger tries to unpack this midrash, this parable. And this is what he says. He says, this mashal needs a little bit of explanation. Of course it does. Now, how does it apply to the Mishkan? Hello, he says, the place of the Mishkan is fixed. But we know how it's constructed, so it's not as though we think that there's a special room to the side, we're going to put another room there. Like, it's all been well laid out. There's a plan. You can figure it out. You can draw it out. You can sketch it out. So what's this little side room that the king is asking for? Like, how does that play out from the parable to what the parable represents? And who's the single daughter? Like, in the whole story of Hashem and the Mishkan, who's the daughter? What is that? So this is what he says, very clever. He says, it applies to the Torah. The Aleha Shayach Bat Yechida. The Torah is the daughter. The Torah is the daughter. And therefore, says, I can't leave her. I'm not going to leave my daughter alone. Therefore, he asks this. This is beautiful, I think. I'm now reading the words of Rabbi Dov Weinberger. Hu mivakesh mikol Yehudi. God asks every Jew. Shi'aseh lo kiton echad. Asks every Jew to make for himself or herself a small little room. Shiachol ladur oto, that Hashem can dwell in. Hainu shebechol davar shebeolam nimtza lechol hapachot mashuhu hashayach leTorah. That in the world in which you live, find one small thing, says Rabbi Weinberger. Find one small thing that's connected to the Torah. De'ein lecha davar shebeolam shelo yeh ba efsharut limtzo ba nekuda hashayachet leTorah. Because he says it's impossible. It's impossible that if you really want to, of course, you can find one thing that's connected in your life to Torah somehow, somewhere. And that's what Hashem is saying. I want that connection with you. That's the whole point. I want that little space. I want that little room. V'zeo kiton, and that's what that room is. Shemivakesh hakadosh baruch hu meitanu, and that's the space that Hashem is asking from all of us. And then he says, and do you know why, of all the words that Hashem chose to describe the notion of portion, Hashem chose the word, what was the word? Truma. Of course, that's the name of the Parshat, Truma. But for those of you familiar with the word Truma, not only in this Parsha, but in other places within halachic literature in the Bible, in the Torah as well, Truma also serves as the name for, anybody else know? For the name for the portion of produce that a person was obligated to give on a yearly basis, the Jewish farmer, to the Kohen. He had to take and give from his produce every year that was grown. He had to give a portion to the Kohen. And says Rabbi Dov Weinberger, Eladafka Truma, and that specifically was the word chosen. Why? The Hainu Nekudak Tana, because the word Truma in this case makes reference to a small portion. Dechita achat poteret et hakeri, because according to the halachic definition, how much does a person have to give from his produce in order to fulfill the biblical requirement of truma on a yearly basis? And he says, you know what the answer to that is? 1 piece of wheat, that's all. In order to say I fulfill the biblical obligation of truma to the Kohen, I need to take 1 piece of wheat. That's all. That's it. That's what Hashem is asking. 1 small piece of wheat. And therefore, he says, that's the point here. That's what this whole parable is. Hashem says, I just want a space. I want a space in your heart. It doesn't have to be a big space. It doesn't have to be, but wherever you go, realize that you can find connections to me everywhere you go. And that's, according to Dov Weinberger, why the Torah opens up with this, what the parable is, with the king who wants that connection, and why the Torah specifically chose the word truma, because truma is connected to the biblical requirement to give the gift to the Kohen, and that you can fulfill with the smallest amount. And so too, we can fulfill that connection to God with something small. You don't have to be a Torah scholar. You don't. I mean, it's as easy as saying a bracha before you have your cup of coffee, saying Baruch Hashem, Modeh Ani, whatever it is. I don't have to go, you can figure it out as well as I can. So that's the opening idea. Continuing in Perek Chaf Hey, I'm going to skip a little bit now when it gets to Pasuk Yud. And Pasuk Yud is now telling us about the construction of the Aron. So just to remind you, the Aron is the place in which the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the 2 tablets that Moshe brought down from Sinai. First he broke the first set, then he went up and got a second set, brought the second set down, and the second set and the broken pieces of the first set of the 2 Shnei Luchot HaBrit. Those were the ones, that's what was put inside the Aron. Also, the Tzin Senet Haman was put inside a little bunch of man, and also the Mateh, the staff of Aharon, which it's not, that story doesn't happen until later on in Sefer B'Midbar. The staff which blossomed and had almonds on it, that also was put inside the Aron. But let's go back. The Aron was actually a series of 3 boxes. 3 wooden boxes made out of acacia wood, atzei shitim. They were covered in gold, and then there was a top to it that had a gold crown around the 4 edges, and then on top of that flat top of the aron were 2 kruvim cherubim. That is the transliteration of the Hebrew word. There really is no English translation, which had knafayim, wings that were facing up, and 2 faces, children's faces, that faced each other. Okay. Now, as the Torah describes the aron, it says the dimensions. Thus, and I'm reading. V'asu aron atzei shitim amatayim v'chetzi orko v'ama v'chetzi rochbo v'ama v'chetzi komato. They shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. Okay. And again, like, what's the significance of the dimensions? And let's ask it more specifically in light of what I'm about to teach you, which is, what's with the half? Like, why half measures? Why not give me whole numbers? 1.5 cubits. Amatayim v'chetzi. Like, why do that? And so, oh my goodness, there's so many meforshim on this, and I'm just going to share one idea with you. This is Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin. We've talked about him before in his commentary called Oznayim La Torah. And in his commentary on this pasuk, Rabbi Sorotskin suggests that the idea of deliberately creating a requirement of half measures when it came to the aron specifically was deliberate. Why? Because what was inside the aron? Well, the Shnei Lukot Habrit. And the Shnei Lukot Habrit, of course, not only are that item, but they're an iconic item, isn't it? The Shnei Lukot Habrit represent what? Represent all of Torah Kula. It had the 10 commandments on it, the 10 sayings, the 10 statements. But lest we think that these are just the 10 mitzvot that are most important in all the Torah, many of the Meforshim amongst them go on say, well, that's not true. The 10 sayings, the Aseret HaDibrot, really were an encapsulation of all the 613 mitzvot. Each one of the 10 was a category of mitzvot, and all of the mitzvot of the Torah somehow can be subsumed under these 10. So the Aron HaEdut becomes the symbol of the Shnei Lukot Habrit, which themselves are the iconic symbolic representation of the entire Torah. Okay. But listen to the word I just said, the entire Torah. So what does the word entire sort of conjure up? Wholeness, entire, all, whole, complete. And yet the Torah says, well, I don't want a measurement that's a complete number. I want a half. I want 2.5 on what? There's got to be halves here. Why? So Rabbi Sorotskin says, because what was in the Aron HaEdut was the Aseret HaDibrot, the Shnei Lukot Habrit, which represent what? The Torah Shebichtav. Torah Shebichtav. Now, what's the Torah Shebichtav? The Torah Shebichtav ultimately are the Chamisha Chomshei Torah. That's what we're studying. We're studying a Parsha every week. That is the Torah Shebichtav. All the mitzvot, all the things that the Torah has to teach us, which were recorded by Moshe Rabbeinu during the 40 years in the desert, that constitutes the Torah Shebichtav that existed at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. Okay, so why the half measure? It says the Uznayim La Torah, because Hashem wants us to understand that that's only a half. The Torah Shebichtav represents only half of our Torah, because we have 2 Torahs. So one Torah is only half of our collection of Torah. What's the other half? Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law. So Hashem wanted specifically that we understand that the measurements of this holy vessel, the measurements convey the notion of incompleteness. That if all you have is the Torah Shebichtav, all you have. If what you have is the Torah Shebichtav without its partner, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, it represents an incomplete Torah. And to move beyond that, this is not what the Uznayim La Torah says. I just want to make you aware of an interesting explanation. I think pretty much most of the men, and maybe all the women as well, know that in the morning, as we start our davening, we recite two brachot. They're called Birchot Torah. And the Birchot Torah, for anybody, a man who's had an aliyah, there's the bracha that we recite before we have the aliyah. There's the bracha we recite after we have the aliyah. But that's also part of the liturgy in the morning. We always start with Birchot Torah. Birchot Torah are one of two brachot which are biblically required. One is obligated to say them. So the first bracha, Asher Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech haolam, Asher bachar banu mikol amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch Ata Hashem Noten HaTorah, Baruch Ata Hashem Asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu, Baruch Ata Hashem Noten HaTorah. So we have two brachot. But why do we have two brachot? Why do we have two different brachot? And so if we take a look at some of the legal codes of the Jewish people, one of them is the Arba Turim, which is the predecessor of the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. The Tur was a earlier collection using the division that the Shulchan Aruch later adopted, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a very, very extensive commentary on the Tur, and from that commentary he compiled and later used that to form his own compendium called the Shulchan Aruch. But if we take a look at the Tur, he makes it very interesting. Said Perush Torah Emet he. When we use the phrase Torah Emet, Torah Emet, and it's part of the language, and I just quoted it in the bracha. He Torah shebichtav. The Torah Emet is the Torah shebichtav. V'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. An everlasting life he implanted within us. It's an interesting phrase. What does that refer to? According to the Tur, he Torah shebe'al peh, that we have two components, and that's why we have two brachot over the Torah, Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh. And that idea is itself understood to be one of the messages in the measurements of the Aron. And again, the measurements themselves become sources, hopefully, of some inspiration, of teaching that things mean a lot, and we're capable of deriving that meaning. I want to stay on this pasuk. And one more time, Asu Aron Atzei Shitim, we have to make it out of acacia wood, and then again we have Amatayim B'Chetzi Arko, we have these measurements. So I want to share with you, I think, an interesting idea. Again, why are the measurements not whole? So the Kli Yakar, whose name is Rabbi Ephraim Lunshitz, his commentary is usually found in most of the classical versions of the Mikrot Gedolah. And he writes on this Parsha, on this Pasuk, what he thinks the reason is that the numbers are not whole numbers, the measured numbers are whole numbers. And he says the following, that the Aron, as we mentioned, represents Torah. And when it comes to the study of Torah, every person has to feel that he or she is always deficient. You've never created a fullness. You can't ever let yourself feel, oh, I've now covered it all. What do you mean you've covered it all? I've learned all the Torah that there is to learn. That's it. So I'm finished. I mastered all of the Torah. Now, it's possibly true that you could have read all of the books. That's unlikely. There's only a handful of people alive or ever who became masters of all of it. But the point that the Kli Yakar is making is that none of us should feel that we've plateaued. We've reached our limit. We've figured it all out. And we don't have to really progress, because the Torah is Ein Sofit, it's limitless. It's not as though there's a finite body. So it's the year 2023. And for me, going into a Jewish bookstore is like Yetzer Hara City. Walking into a bookstore and seeing all the books that have been printed from year to year, new stuff. Like, how can anybody write anything new? Isn't everything ever thought of already printed? The answer is no. Because Torah is ever unfolding. You may, sitting in this group now, some of you may come up with a chiddush that nobody else thought of. So it has to be new. If nobody else thought about it except you, you've obviously added to the volume of Torah. So you can't ever say there is no more Torah left to learn. I've learned it all. And so therefore, the measurement for that specific vessel, which is associated with Torah, has to be a half measure. It can't be a whole number in order to teach this idea. Whereas, says the Kli Yakar, moving to a vessel, we haven't spoken about the shulchan, but that's the table upon which the lechem apanim was put on a week-to-week basis. So what would if the Aron represents Torah study, what does the shulchan represent? So the shulchan represents wealth and physical success, because after all, that's where the bread is. And you gotta think about it. What's bread? Bread is made out of what? Made out of wheat. But just think for 1 second, what needs to happen in order for a loaf of bread to be created? It sounds silly, but think of all the steps that need to happen for that bread to come. Like, we buy it at a bakery, but in a period, well, for some who don't buy it in bakeries but make it themselves, first of all, there's got to be a farmer who's getting his field ready, planting the seeds, and then growing and doing all the agricultural activity necessary to grow the stalks of wheat. And the stalks of wheat have to be harvested. And the stalk itself, then you have to separate the chaff from the kernel. And then you have to take the seeds and you have to grind them into flour. And then you have to take the flour and water and build. And all those steps bring a loaf of bread. So the loaf of bread represents a sort of human productivity, the world in which we live. And my success in some ways is symbolized by bread. And therefore, when we talk about the shulchan, we want a person to feel al ha'adam. I'm reading from the Kli Yakar. Lahargish shalem in chelko ulehistapek bo. I want a person to feel whole. That's my portion, and my portion is complete. It's okay. Whatever it is that I have is my portion. Nothing's missing. Hashem doesn't make mistakes. This is the portion that Hashem has given me, and I have to learn that that's what it is for me. You know, some people have this mistaken notion: you work harder, you're going to make more money. Is that true? I grew up hearing a lot of that, but is that true? Or maybe it's you're going to make more money because Hashem has assigned you more money in your life. That's where you get the more money from. There may be some people who can they will only earn X amount, which means that's what Hashem decided in the year 2023. This is what Chaim Yankel is going to earn, whatever it is. So if Chaim Yankel adds 13 hours, 40 hours, 50 hours, 100 hours, it's already been decided Chaim Yankel is only going to earn X amount of money. So whose decision is it? Whose efforts are creating that? Whatever I have is given to me by Hashem, and I should feel shalem, which means I should feel shalem. I should feel whole. And so therefore, you might think that these numbers are random. They're not random. The numbers are there to teach us important ideas. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit past this. I have more Torah on that, but we're going to go to something else. So let's stick with chapter Kafhe. And I want to go back to something I made reference to, and that is these kruvim on top of the Aron Eidut. And this is what it says. Listen to this. And Hashem speaking to Moshe, who's later teaching this whole thing to the Jewish people, referring to the kruvim, v'no'adati lecha sham v'dibarti itcha me'al hakaporet mibein shnei hakruvim asher al aron ha'edut et kol asher atzaveh otcha el b'nei Israel. That's chapter 25, pasuk Chafei 22, reading from the Koran, from the Art Scroll translation interpretation. It is there from between the two kruvim. I will set my meetings with you, and I shall speak with you from atop the cover. So the kruvim are uncovered. From between the two from between the two kruvim that are on the Ark of the Testimonial Tablets, everything that I shall command you to the children of Israel. So Hashem is making it really clear that all these sort of teachings that are going to emanate from God to the Jewish people that he's going to share through Moshe, who then has to teach it to the Bnei Israel, all of that is coming from this spot. And how fascinating is it that these two kruvim, as I mentioned to you before, have to have the face of children on it. So all of the Torah taught to the Jewish people emanates from that point between two angelic figures on the top of the Aron Edut that had the faces of children. What's the symbolism there? And of course, there's got to be. Now, I can't say to you that I have the answer because there is no one answer. There's so many different theories about that. But some theories, I don't know, resonate more with me, and maybe others resonate more with you. I'm going to share one with you from one of the former Roshei Yeshiva of the Panovich Yeshiva. His name is Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Panovich, of course, from Eastern Europe, but later moved on to Israel. And Rabbi Rozovsky, Shmuel Rozovsky, was one of the prior Roshei Yeshiva of Yeshiva in Israel. And he writes, in order to learn Torah, we need to maintain the childlike enthusiasm and childlike innocence that will allow us to accept Torah and to integrate it into our personalities. That's not so simple. It's not so simple because we're cynical. As we age, I think we get more cynical. You know, we've been through a lot, we've seen a lot, we've endured a lot. And how much more do we know than when we were those innocent and not so worldly little kids who used to play outside and think everything was great? So is our cynicism a help or a hindrance? And so according to Rabbi Rozovsky, maybe it's a hindrance. Unfortunately, I get why maybe I, an adult, and some of you might be more cynical. Children? Should children be cynical? So, unfortunately, sometimes we impart our cynicism to our kids. And maybe what Rozovsky is suggesting is we can't do that. We must never do that. We must never impart our cynicism of the world to our children so that they experience the world through our eyes. That's not fair. They should have every right to come to their own experiences. But when we give them that maybe somewhat bitter flavor of our cynicism, we're robbing them of something that they even haven't a chance to experience. And again, I'm going to speak a little bit, and I'm hoping I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. But working in a school such as I do, I've often been made aware of certain things that happen in people's homes that I think is exactly this point. Like how many conversations happen around tables where children are listening and the parents, the adults, are talking about teachers, about school, about rabbis, and they may have some observations or opinions or cynical things to say, and they say them to their kids. And I can sometimes have conversations with kids, and kids are saying things, and I'm saying there's no way that kid could have, that those words could have come out of that kid's mouth, other than he's repeating what he's heard some adult say, likely his parents, I can't be for sure. And maybe you've had similar experiences. But I think what Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky is saying is that we as adults need to be careful that our children have the opportunity to experience Torah and Judaism in its purest form and not to become tainted in some ways by maybe some experience that I had, which may have been negative. And there may even be legitimate reasons for you and for me to have whatever opinions we have. But they're my opinions from my experiences, not my kids, not my grandchildren. And so we need to be careful that we try to maintain what Hashem asked us to maintain. That the place that's closest to Torah the purest attitude should be that joy that kids have, and not take away from them what otherwise could be something really elevating, exciting, honest, genuine, pure, and maybe even inspiring. So I think that that's something that we should keep in mind as we move forward. I think I have time for a couple more Divrei Torah, so I'm going to continue. We talked a little bit about the shulchan. Shulchan is a table. Now, everybody has a shulchan in their home. Everybody has their version of a shulchan. It's not the vessel that's necessarily the same dimension, looks exactly the same the way it looked in the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan. But we have our version of a shulchan, and we have the lechem that goes on our shulchan. And so what is our shulchan about? It's not just the utilitarian practical vessel that we have in our house that allows us to work or to write things or to eat. It goes deeper than that. The shulchan too, in our homes, becomes a symbol of something. It becomes a symbol of tzedakah, doesn't it? Because you invite people to sit around your shulchan. You invite people to sit around your table and to partake of your meal, to partake of your conversation. And the bigger your shulchan, and here I'm not really referring to the size of the shulchan, the bigger your generosity of opening up your shulchan to people who can come and sit with you and benefit from you, well, that's a fulfillment of what the shulchan should be. The shulchan should be that place that sustains. And in fact, in one of the sources that I was reading in preparation for learning this Parsha, I came across a fascinating piece of information that talked about a old custom amongst the Gedolim in France many centuries ago. And what they used to do, some of these Gedolim, of course, had opened up their home, as did other people who were not necessarily Torah scholars, but they were philanthropic, they were compassionate Jews who invited a lot of people around their table. And apparently a common custom became popular, which was that when the owner of that table, the Balabai, passed away, instructions were left that the wood from which the table was made, because that was the common material from which the tables were made, they would take that wood and they would make the coffin out of the wood from the table. And it's a fascinating idea, because the table was the place that the Baal Habayit demonstrated his compassion, his kindness, and his chesed to the aniyim by inviting them into his home and seating them, and treating them with dignity, and sharing conversation, and sharing Torah, and sharing food. So the notion is, what were we created for? We weren't created for the purpose of eating and drinking, but rather we were created for the purpose of eating and drinking so that we would be able to do our higher purpose. Eating and drinking is just the means necessary for you and I to reach our intended goal, which is to deal with Torah, to become elevated human beings, to help other people in their lives. L'takein olam b'malchut shakai, that our job is to bring something to the rest of the world, to our community. And so the idea of using your table, which is in some ways a recreation of the table in the Beit HaMikdash, which was a place of sustenance, both physical sustenance, that's why they had the luchot, but physical sustenance which had a higher purpose. The Hasidim had a custom, and I saw this when I went for the very first time to visit my mother, Zichron Livracha, had a brother, Zichron Livracha, who was a Ger Chassid, important Chassid in the Ger community in Israel, Yerushalayim. And I went there for the first time, and I was a teenager, I think I was 16 years old, and I'd never been at around the table of true Hasidim, but I noticed, and some of you may know, that they didn't use knives, and they ate more of the food with their hands than they did with the cutlery, because according to the Torah, the certain tools were not to be used in the creation of some of the vessels. You weren't allowed to take a sword, metal, right? Because metal swords were used for ending a person's life, but the kalim in the mikdash were intended to lengthen a person's life. They were there to bring life, not to take life. So if you thought that your shulchan somehow was drawing its spiritual energy from the shulchan that's mentioned in this week's parsha, then we try to recreate in some way a little bit about that spiritual energy. And so they didn't put cutlery. Why? Because just like metal tools were not used to create parts of the kalim, so too in my shulchan, we don't use cutlery. Now it sounds, ooh, but I don't know. There's something deeply spiritual about people who find the rituals that have spiritual power to them. And if you're open to that, and if we just take a step back and say, you know what, I want that in my life. I want to feel that feeling. I think we all do. I think we all want to feel inspired. And so you're going to be reading Parshat Truma and Shul on Shabbos. Maybe before Shabbos, you're going to go over it. And instead of saying, oh my God, this is so boring. I can't, there's no story, there's no hero, there's no drama. Maybe it's not the drama that we need. Maybe it's the uplifting. Maybe it's the messages. Maybe it's the ideas that the details that seem to be mundane are not mundane at all. They're the details that maybe hold it all together. Now I'm going to end with a story. I've told the story before, but I still think it's a great story. The story is told of an impoverished little shtetl in Europe. Nobody had a lot of money. And this poor guy and his wife, they're trying to eke out a living, but nothing is going. And she calls him over and says, Yankala, listen, we're kahaktatsulas here. The kids don't have food. They don't have clothes. You have to find something. Epis, you got to find something that you can sell so that we'll have a couple of cents to buy something. So this poor guy leaves his home and says, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get money? Am I going to go into the shul and rob the pushka? I can't do that. But the place that people somehow collected was the shul. So he goes into the shul. It's not going to take the pushka. But those days, many of the shuls had a geniza room, which was like on the second floor. It was a stairwell that went up. Often the rabbi had his office in one room. He had a little desk medrash for the office, the study of the rebbe, the rabbi. And then beside that, there was a little room in which they put geniza, the old tefillin, the old palesim, the chumashim, the siddurim. So he goes there. Nobody's there. It was late one night. And he walks into the room, but there's no light switch. You can't see anything. So maybe there's something in the room that he can take. It's a geniza room after all, which means that most of the things there people don't want. So maybe you can find something that somebody somewhere he can peddle. So he's going in, it's pitch black. He's on his hands and knees so he doesn't bump into anything, doesn't get hurt. And he's trying to feel his way in the dark. It's absolutely pitch dark. And he finds something. Metal. Metal might be worth a couple of grosh. So it's stuck. So he tries. My gosh, it's starting to move. And he's twisting it. It's moving and it's moving and it's moving. Okay, maybe again. He loosens it and he picks it up. And 3 seconds later, there's this enormous crash. Bang, boom. Oh my gosh. He jumps up, smashes his head. He's so scared and he runs out. And before he leaves, he looks and says, what was the crash? Chandelier in the base midrash had crashed to the ground. He, of course, loosened the bolt that had kept it tied up to the ceiling. And what's the purpose of the story? Some of those little details, you know what? Those details keep things together. Sometimes those little details help bring the light that we need. And so here at Son, may the light of Parshat Truma give us a little bit of inspiration. May what seems to be boring details not be boring. May they be the repository of teachings that move us, that guide us, that enrich us, illuminate us, and give us inspiration for yet another week. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm so grateful that you did. And please feel free to unmute yourselves.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Good Chodesh.
Thank you.
That was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. Gorgeous is good. I think that's a compliment, right? Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Baruch Hashem.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was great.
You're very welcome, my friends. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, everybody. A healthy
Thank you, Rabbi.
week.
You as well.
Thank you, Rabbi
Yes,
Dan.
yes, Thank you.
Thank you.
everybody. Hi,
Thank you.
Eva. Good to see you.
Thank
Marty.
you.
Hi, Esther. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Brenda, thank you. Good night, everybody. Jonathan, everybody.
Night.
Good night.
Bye.
Milka. Good night, everyone. Charlie, good night.
Night.
Les, thank you. Good to see you. Marika, thank you so much.